This is the story of the Smolensk air disaster. If you've been a long-time viewer of the channel, then you'll be like, wait, you've done this video before. Why are you doing it again? Yeah, you're right, I have. But that was the Russian version of events. You see, this crash is controversial. To this day, the Russians and the Polish still can't agree on what exactly happened to the Polish presidential plane. So I think we should listen to what Poland has to say on the whole matter. When it comes to this crash, there's just so much noise out there, to the point that the official reports from both countries are pushing their own narrative. Therefore, I think it's important to look at the issue from both sides. That way, you can make a choice for yourself as to what really happened. Covering anything related to Poland, Russia, or even Europe today can be a political minefield. While researching this video, I came across multiple articles on the whole Poland-Russia situation. Some say that Poland is pushing its will on Russia, and some others say that Russia is trying to mess with Poland. The reporting is all over the place, with each publication trying to push their own agenda. Like I said, it's a minefield. That's why I'm a fan of the website and app by Ground News. Their platform aggregates breaking news from across thousands of local and international sources in one place, so we can quickly drill down on all sides of the story to see what's really going on. From Ground News' bias scale, we can see that most of the reporting for this story comes from left-leaning or centrist publications. Ground News shows the ownership of each source, and we can compare headlines from all the sources reporting on it. Then you can click in and read any article from its original source. This allows you to form your own opinion on topics by knowing who's saying what and where their allegiances lie. I particularly like that you can follow specific topics or interests. I'm following news about plane crashes and aircraft so I can stay current on breaking news stories that I might have otherwise missed so that I can tell you guys. Ground News is a small team working to bring transparency to the news we consume and give easy access to reliable information from all sides. Go to Ground News/mini-air to check it out for free. If you support the mission and find it as useful as I do, subscribe for unlimited access through my link and get 30% off the Vantage subscription. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. It really helps the channel out. On the 9th of March 2010, the Polish president, Lech Kaczyński, was on its way to Smolensk in Russia. It was for the commemoration of the Katyn massacre. This flight would be performed by the Tu-154 of the Polish Air Force. Prep for his trip had begun a month in advance. The embassy of Poland in Russia was abuzz with activity as they sorted out the logistics of the mission. Having a Russian-speaking crew would make the trip a lot easier, as the Russian controllers were more comfortable with Russian over English. These were the sorts of things that needed to be discussed between the Polish and the Russians. With the prep work done, the plane took off at 5:27 a.m. with 96 people on board. As the jet turned towards Russia, they climbed to their cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. As they were passing through Belarusian airspace, they were in contact with Minsk control, and they got the first taste of the weather that was waiting for them at Smolensk. Polish Air Force 101 for information at 061, Smolensk visibility 400 meters, fog. End quote. It was foggy at a small runway in Russia. It wasn't the best of conditions, but it also wasn't the worst. As they got closer, they kept getting more and more updates. Papa Lima Foxtrot 1201, Korzas fog, visibility 400 meters. By the way, Korzas is the designator for the Smolensk airport. At this time, the pilots were in contact with the pilots of a Yak-40 that had landed an hour before them, and he was relaying the weather that he experienced to the pilots of the presidential plane. He did not have good news. The visibility was about 400 meters, but the ceiling was low at 50 meters. It was so bad that an IL-76 after the Yak-40 had to go around twice. Since this was a presidential plane, the captain couldn't just be like, hey, this is bad, let's go somewhere else. He passed that information on to the diplomatic director. He let the director know that the weather was bad and they probably would not be able to make a landing, and that they'd try for a landing, but it wasn't guaranteed. The captain said, well then, we have a problem. We could hold for about half an hour and then go to an alternate airport. The director then took that information to the president to see what he said. But even as the plane started its descent into Smolensk, the president had not made a decision yet. As they were downwind to the base leg, the controller asked the crew if he had ever landed at Smolensk. The captain had landed in Smolensk before, just days ago, so this shouldn't be too hard. But as the plane made the turn to the base leg, the controller warned the crew that they should be ready to go around at a moment's notice when they hit 100 meters, as the weather was quite bad. As the plane lined up with the final approach, the controller started giving the crew their position with respect to the glide path. But things were not going well for the crew of Flight 101. When they were 8.3 kilometers away from the runway, the Tu-154 was 130 meters above the glide slope, and the plane was slightly climbing. As the flight progressed, the controller kept guiding the plane down. But in the cockpit, the TAWS engaged, and the terrain ahead warning lit up in the cockpit. This was because Smolensk airport was not in the database of the Tu-154, so as far as the plane was concerned, they were landing in the middle of nowhere, hence the alarm. So they silenced the alarm. The crew kept going. When they were 4.6 kilometers from the runway, they were still having problems. The plane was a bit too high, and they were a little bit left of the runway. That didn't really change as they got closer and closer to the runway, except for one tiny thing. The plane started to slip below the glide slope. The pilots knew that something was wrong when they were 91 meters above the runway. The captain had had enough. He called for a go-around, but the plane still kept dropping. This is when the pilots got a warning that they were dangerously low. The controller could see that the plane was struggling to climb. He put out a call saying, "Level flight, Flight 101. Due to the downward momentum of the plane, it kept losing altitude, and then it started striking trees. For a second, it looked like the jet would make it away, but the left wing of the plane hit a tree, shearing off about a third of it. That was it for Flight 101. No one on board survived. The head of a major Western power was killed in a plane crash in Russian territory. So understandably, this kicked off two investigations, one Russian and one Polish. The Polish investigation started off at the very basics of the flight. How was this flight conducted? Now, since this was a military flight, the rules that applied to regular civilian flights did not apply. That was a problem because in civilian aviation, there's a clear demarcation of duties, but the military rules did not specify who should do what. In simple terms, the standard operating procedure of this flight left a lot unsaid. In addition to that, they started digging into the history of the pilots and they uncovered some unsettling stuff. The pilots were trained hastily and non-methodically, and the documentation left a lot to be desired. What's even more shocking is that the crew did not have a lot of experience flying the Tu-154. Most of them cut their teeth on the Yak-40, a smaller airplane. On top of that, their training was mostly conducted in fair weather, and they used ILS a lot, meaning that the conditions on the day of the accident was quite challenging for them to overcome. Basically, the training that the pilots got did not prepare them for the real world. And once the training was done, the pilots were not given any additional refresher or simulator training to keep their skills sharp. On top of that, CRM was not really emphasized in their training. They found out that the pilots had not gotten any TAWS or Terrain Awareness Warning System or TCAS training. This would turn out to be fatal later as the crews were accustomed to ignoring terrain warnings. Then, when the plane lined up with the runway, the crew were busy with checklists. Thus, they were not able to start their descent on time. This meant that the plane was above the glide slope, and by the time the plane was near the outer marker, it was more than 100 meters above the glide path. This meant that the captain had to descend even faster to catch up with the glide slope. That had serious ramifications for the rest of the flight. You see, when the captain did this, the engines had gone to their minimum power setting. Now, that's a problem because if you suddenly needed power for any reason whatsoever, say for a go-around or something, then it would take the engines a long time to respond and get back up to full power. If all of this wasn't enough, the pilots actively inhibited the terrain warning system on the Tu-154 by messing with the altitude calibration, making the plane think that it was higher than it was. At this point, the crew were focused on the radio altimeter. This was a grave mistake because the area around the airport was very uneven and the ground sloped up towards the airport. So relying on just the radio altimeter would not give you a real understanding of where you were in relation to the airport. If that wasn't enough, a go-around was not carried out when the plane hit the minimum descent altitude. Remember, they had bad visibility and they had to go around when they hit that altitude if they did not have the runway in sight, but the captain did not. The captain of this flight was under a lot of pressure, to be honest. Sure, he was flying the president of Poland, but at the same time, he was proficient in Russian, So he was the one handling the radio calls as well. This meant that he was flying the plane and talking to the controllers. That's not good. All of this while he was flying through bad weather into a relatively unfamiliar airport. That's a recipe for disaster right there. As all of this was happening, what was the controller doing? The controller had radar, and he should have been able to see that the plane was going off course. You see, there's a maximum allowable deviation for this approach, and by the time this plane was 9 kilometers from the runway, this plane was very much outside that level of acceptable deviation. But shockingly, throughout most of the approach, the controller just said, "You're on glide," and he did not tell the pilots that they were way off course and not even lined up with the runway correctly. This was because the radar system malfunctioned. There was no option to adjust the gain on the radar system. This meant that the controllers could not correct the pilots who thought that they were on glide. With that, the fate of the airplane was pretty much sealed. Now, the Polish delegation kind of had to guess all of this about the radar system because the Russians never really let the Polish investigators interview the controllers. Quote, "Due to the Russian party not having provided important documents and not having permitted a repeated interrogation of the ATC group, the committee based its analysis primarily on the actual flight trajectory of the Tu-154M aircraft and on voice recordings at inner ATC post and in the aircraft cockpit. Lack of LZZ's reaction to further deviation of the aircraft below the glide path was an important factor in the accident." End quote. The discourse around this crash is quite toxic, to be honest. Even after 13 years, there are conspiracy theories flying around everywhere you look. Some people say that this plane was taken down by Russian forces, and with such high-profile people on board, I can see why. I'm not saying it happened. I'm saying I can see where they're coming from. This is the Polish equivalent of Air Force One going down. These are the facts taken straight from the Polish report. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.